March 1945. The city of Cologne lies in ruins. The remnants of homes, businesses, and centuries-old buildings now smolder in the aftermath of a relentless Allied bombing campaign. The roar of Allied aircraft still echoes through the air as American bombers, their missions accomplished, return to base. The destruction is vast. Families have been torn apart, livelihoods erased, and the spirit of the once proud city shattered. The civilians who remain walk among the rubble, their faces hollow, as the weight of the war presses down on them. As they sift through the wreckage, desperate for food and water, a group of American soldiers enters the city. Their uniforms are tattered, their faces hardened by years of combat. They are here not to fight, but to provide something that none of the German civilians could have expected in the wake of the devastation: aid. The soldiers, carrying extra rations meant for their own use, look out at the hungry, desperate civilians. It's a quiet moment, the weight of the war hanging heavily between the two sides. Without hesitation, the American soldiers begin to share their food, biscuit tins and cans of meat, offering rations to the very people who had been their enemies just days earlier. The German civilians, stunned and bewildered, can hardly comprehend the kindness being extended to them. This simple act of mercy, amid the chaos and destruction of war, is a moment that none of them could have ever imagined. For these civilians, the gesture goes beyond just the food. It's a sign that humanity can still emerge, even in the most brutal of times. The disbelief in their eyes speaks volumes. After everything, the enemy soldiers are showing mercy. By the spring of 1945, World War II was reaching its final stages. The Allies were advancing rapidly through Europe, and the Third Reich, once an unstoppable military juggernaut, was crumbling under the pressure of relentless Allied forces. The bombing campaigns over Germany had intensified, and cities across the country, including Cologne, were reduced to rubble. The Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, used air power to carry out strategic bombing campaigns aimed at crippling Germany's industrial capabilities and demoralizing the civilian population. The bombing of German cities, such as Cologne, was part of a broader strategy that had started in earnest in 1942 with the goal of weakening the Nazi regime's ability to continue fighting the war. While the British Royal Air Force, RAF, had already been bombing Germany for years, the American air raids, executed by the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, added a new, highly coordinated effort. American bombers, primarily the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, targeted vital industrial hubs, transportation centers, and military facilities. But the bombing also took a heavy toll on civilian areas. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, killing tens of thousands of civilians and leaving many more homeless. Cologne, one of Germany's oldest and most significant cities, was no exception. A major industrial and transportation hub, the city had been heavily bombed by the Allies. The most devastating raid occurred on May 30, 1942, when the British RAF carried out a massive attack on the city, targeting its industrial infrastructure. The city was hit again in subsequent years, with the raids becoming progressively more intense. By early 1945, much of Cologne lay in ruins, and the civilians who remained were living in the aftermath of destruction. By this time, the German military was no longer able to defend the skies effectively. The Luftwaffe, once a force to be reckoned with, had been severely depleted. The strategic bombing campaigns by the Allies, combined with the relentless pressure on all fronts, had caused the German war effort to collapse. With Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied forces from the west, it was clear that the Third Reich was on the verge of collapse. Amid this destruction, the German civilian population was enduring unimaginable hardship. Food was in short supply, and the city's infrastructure had been so heavily damaged that basic necessities such as water and electricity were unavailable. Those who survived the bombings faced a grueling existence, scrambling to find shelter and food in the ruined city. The psychological toll on the civilians was immense. Many were devastated by the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. The sense of helplessness and despair hung over the population like a dark cloud, as they struggled to survive in a city that had once been a symbol of German pride. For the American soldiers who were now advancing into Germany, the situation was similarly dire. The Allied forces had been fighting through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, pushing the German military back on all fronts. As they entered Cologne, many soldiers were undoubtedly weary from the long and bloody campaign. They had witnessed the horrors of war firsthand, lost comrades, and endured the hardships of combat. Yet, despite the suffering and destruction they encountered, the soldiers were also driven by a sense of duty and a commitment to seeing the war through to the end. As the American soldiers moved through the bombed-out city, they found themselves confronted with civilians who had been living in the midst of the devastation. The sight of the starving, destitute civilians was a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Yet, it was in this moment that the American soldiers made a decision that would leave a lasting impression on the survivors. With their own rations in short supply, they chose to share what they had with the German civilians who were struggling to survive. This act of kindness, in the face of such brutality, was a profound gesture of humanity. It was an act that transcended national borders, an acknowledgement that even in the most destructive conflict in human history, there was still room for compassion. The German civilians, who had spent years living under the oppression of the Nazi regime, were now the beneficiaries of a mercy they had not expected. The shock and disbelief on their faces spoke volumes. These were civilians who had witnessed the horrors of war. Many had lost family members, homes, and livelihoods in the bombings. They had been on the receiving end of Allied air raids, and their lives had been turned upside down. Now, in the midst of the ruins, they were receiving help from those they had once seen as their enemies. The moment was powerful, not only for its unexpected nature, but for its symbolic weight. It was a rare instance where humanity triumphed over the dehumanizing effects of war. The American soldiers, who had fought fiercely against the Germans for years, now showed mercy to the very civilians who had once been aligned with the Nazi regime. In doing so, they demonstrated that despite the horrors of war, there was still room for compassion, even for those who had been part of the enemy. For the German civilians, the sight of American soldiers sharing their rations was nothing short of miraculous. Having endured years of bombings, starvation, and the horrors of war, the civilians of Cologne and other bombed cities had reached a breaking point. In the months and years leading up to this moment, they had witnessed the destruction of their homes, their communities, and their families. Many had already lost everything they had. Homes reduced to rubble, loved ones killed in air raids, and entire neighborhoods flattened in the wake of the bombings. The relentless airstrikes, the crumbling of the German military, and the collapse of the Nazi regime left the civilian population emotionally and physically drained. As the war progressed, the civilians had begun to lose faith in the prospect of victory. They had been living under constant air raids, never knowing when the next bomb would fall or if they would survive the night. The hope of a swift end to the conflict had all but evaporated, and many were simply focused on trying to survive the ongoing destruction. But when the American soldiers entered the bombed city, their actions defied all expectations. The act of the American soldiers. Sharing their food was not just about providing nourishment. It was a gesture that symbolized the possibility of redemption and humanity amidst the chaos of war. For the German civilians, who had seen their homes and cities destroyed by the Allied bombings, it was a gesture of compassion they had not anticipated. In the midst of the devastation, they were confronted by a reminder that even those who had been their enemies could show mercy. It was a moment of profound psychological impact, as the civilians, many of whom had been subjected to years of Nazi propaganda, now saw the Americans as more than just the enemy. They saw them as individuals capable of acts of kindness and humanity. The shock of receiving food from the soldiers was compounded by the guilt and emotional weight many German civilians felt. These were not just people who had been caught in the crossfire of war. They were part of the country that had waged aggression across Europe, that had initiated the conflict. Many of them had supported the Nazi regime, either through active participation or passive complicity. The mercy shown by the American soldiers forced them to confront their own role in the war, the suffering it had caused, and the question of how they could ever atone for the destruction their country had brought to the world. Yet, in that moment, the American soldiers were offering not judgment, but compassion, allowing the civilians to see a path forward beyond their guilt and suffering. War is often viewed through the lens of brutality, where the enemy is dehumanized and acts of mercy are rare. Yet, in the aftermath of the bombing campaigns that had ravaged Germany, one of the most unexpected and profound moments of the war came not from the battlefield, but from a simple act of humanity: the sharing of rations. It was an act of kindness that cut through the deeply entrenched animosities between the warring nations, showing that even in the midst of total destruction, there was room for mercy. The moral significance of this act cannot be overstated. The civilians in Cologne, many of whom had been living under the harsh conditions imposed by the Nazi regime, had endured unimaginable hardships. They had been subjected to constant air raids, the loss of family members, and the crumbling of their once proud cities. The devastation they witnessed was beyond anything they had ever imagined. In their darkest hour, when survival seemed uncertain, the American soldiers extended a hand of mercy, offering them food and support. This act of mercy challenged the prevailing view of the enemy. For the German civilians, who had been subjected to Nazi propaganda and had grown accustomed to seeing the Allies as their enemies, the generosity of the American soldiers was not just unexpected, it was transformative. It forced them to see the soldiers not as mere combatants, but as human beings capable of compassion and kindness. This shift in perspective was crucial in the broader moral arc of the war, as it showed that even amidst the horrors of war, humanity could still emerge. The soldiers, by offering their rations, transcended the roles of enemies and became symbols of a higher moral standard, one that recognized the suffering of the innocent and sought to alleviate it, rather than perpetuate it. For the American soldiers, this act was not just about food. It was about showing that they, too, understood the human cost of the war. They had witnessed the suffering of civilians in countries they had liberated and had experienced the devastating effects of war firsthand. By sharing their rations, they demonstrated that their fight was not just for military victory, but for the restoration of humanity. The decision to offer mercy to the German civilians, despite the years of war and the destruction they had caused, was a profound moral act that redefined the nature of the enemy. It was an acknowledgement that, even in the midst of war, compassion could triumph over hatred. From a purely tactical perspective, the decision by U.S. soldiers to share their rations with German civilians may seem unexpected in the midst of wartime strategy. However, this act of kindness had a subtle yet profound tactical impact, not only on the morale of the German civilians, but also on the perception of American forces as they moved through war-torn cities. As the U.S. soldiers advanced through the remnants of bombed-out cities, the question of how to engage with the local population, especially in occupied territories, was one that could influence the effectiveness of future military operations. The practical implications of sharing food with the civilian population went beyond just providing basic sustenance. At the heart of this action was the concept of psychological warfare. By providing food and showing mercy, the American soldiers were reinforcing a message. They were not just conquerors, but liberators. As the soldiers distributed their rations, it reinforced a sense of camaraderie, a moral high ground that contrasted sharply with the often brutal tactics used by the Axis powers. It was a strategic move that not only helped improve the immediate conditions of the civilians, but also sowed the seeds for future cooperation and trust between the occupying forces and the civilian population. Sharing rations with civilians also had a long-term tactical effect on post-war rebuilding. During the war, and particularly after the defeat of Nazi Germany, American leadership recognized that occupying forces had to do more than just destroy the enemy. They had to engage in nation-building and offer a sense of stability to those living in the ruins of war. The kindness shown by American soldiers to civilians in bombed cities like Cologne helped lay the groundwork for the eventual rebuilding of Germany and the establishment of democratic institutions. It also provided the Allies with a powerful psychological advantage over the remaining Nazi sympathizers in the region, showing the German civilians that the Americans were interested in restoring normalcy, not simply crushing their enemies. In a tactical sense, sharing food during the final stages of the war was an attempt to ensure that the civilian population could continue to survive and rebuild. When you have a populace on the edge of starvation and psychological collapse, the ability to offer a tangible sign of human decency, such as sharing food, goes beyond the military aim of simply winning a war. It helps lay the foundation for long-term peace and stability, a vital aspect that often gets overlooked in the wake of wartime devastation. While the soldiers' sharing of their rations represented an extraordinary moment of compassion, it was also rooted in the logistical and technological advancements made by the Allies during the war. The U.S. Army's ability to supply troops with sufficient rations was crucial to the success of their campaigns, especially as they moved deeper into enemy territories. The logistical operations that ensured soldiers were fed, equipped, and able to fight effectively were also key to ensuring that these soldiers could interact with the civilian population in a way that was both practical and strategic. By 1945, the U.S. military's logistical capabilities had evolved significantly, thanks to the rapid advancements in supply chains, transportation, and field support. The U.S. Army could now transport supplies across vast distances, often in less than ideal conditions. This technological advantage allowed American soldiers to remain well supplied, even as they moved through war-torn cities where infrastructure had been destroyed. This abundance of resources, particularly food, enabled the soldiers to share their rations with civilians, without compromising their own operational needs. The ability to provide rations in these difficult situations was a direct result of technological advancements in wartime logistics. Innovations such as the use of specialized food packages, like K-rations, and improved transport vehicles ensured that U.S. soldiers could operate efficiently, even in the most dire of circumstances. These logistical advances not only supported military operations, but allowed for the kind of humanitarian gestures, like sharing food with civilians, that improved the morale of both the soldiers and the population. The strategic importance of these logistical capabilities cannot be understated. They were not only crucial for the immediate military campaigns, but also for ensuring that American forces could win hearts and minds in the occupied territories. By providing food and supplies to German civilians, the Allies were able to counteract the devastating effects of years of total war, offering a symbol of hope and restoration that would help pave the way for post-war peace efforts. The climax of this momentous event came when American soldiers, in the aftermath of bombing campaigns and the chaotic fighting in the final stages of World War II, entered Cologne and other heavily bombed German cities. For the German civilians who had witnessed the horrors of the war, this moment represented more than just the arrival of enemy soldiers. It was a profound shock to their system. They had been living through a relentless onslaught of bombings, witnessing the destruction of their homes, cities, and lives. At this stage, their hopes had long since been crushed by the Nazi regime, and they were left with little more than the remnants of their once thriving cities and the overwhelming weight of defeat. Then, in the midst of their misery, the unthinkable happened. American soldiers, weary from years of combat, began sharing their precious rations with the civilians they had been fighting. The German civilians, many of whom had been indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda to see the Allies as ruthless and merciless, were stunned by this act of kindness. The first time they received food from their enemies, the shock was palpable. How could the soldiers who had just decimated their cities offer them food after everything they had endured? It was a moment of cognitive dissonance that completely overturned their understanding of the war and their adversaries. For the American soldiers, sharing their rations was not just a practical necessity, it was a powerful statement. After years of enduring horrific combat, these soldiers had a deep sense of camaraderie with their fellow soldiers, and in the final stages of the war, they recognized the humanity of the very civilians who had suffered under Nazi rule. Their act of sharing rations wasn't just about providing food, it was about restoring some semblance of humanity in a world where the war had stripped it away. For the German civilians, this act marked the beginning of a new chapter. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the hope that even after the darkest days of war, humanity could still shine through. For the soldiers, the shock of seeing the civilians accept their help was equally profound. These were the same civilians who, just weeks earlier, had been fighting against the very people who now offered them aid. This moment, when the U.S. soldiers reached across the divide of war and extended mercy, was a turning point in the narrative of the war. It showed that, even in the bitterest of conflicts, there was still space for acts of kindness and compassion. The soldiers, who had witnessed so much destruction, found a sense of reconciliation in their humanitarian gesture, while the German civilians, faced with the defeat of their own regime, saw a flicker of humanity in the people they had been taught to hate. The emotional weight of this moment, when the U.S. soldiers shared their rations and offered hope in the form of sustenance, was monumental. It shattered the narratives that both sides had carried throughout the war. For the German civilians, it was a moment of humbling realization that the enemy they had feared was also capable of acts of mercy. For the American soldiers, it was a reminder that, even in the harshest of times, they were fighting for something greater than just military victory. They were fighting for the restoration of humanity and the possibility of peace. In that moment, the war ceased to be just a military conflict. It became a struggle for human dignity. The American soldiers, by sharing their food, symbolically offered not just a physical resource, but a glimpse of the post-war world they hoped to build. One where the devastation of the war could be overcome with acts of kindness and cooperation. For the civilians of Cologne, who had lived through years of terror and loss, this unexpected moment of generosity was a ray of light in the darkness, a signal that the war was ending and that a new beginning was possible. As the American soldiers continued to share their rations with the stunned German civilians, a profound shift began to take place, not just in the lives of those directly involved, but in the broader context of the war. For the soldiers, this was not merely an act of charity. It was a moment of reflection on the human cost of war and their role in it. They had been fighting for years, their lives defined by violence, destruction, and survival. The sight of the broken city and the desperate, starving civilians was a stark reminder of the devastation they had caused in their pursuit of victory. Yet, as they offered food to those who had been their enemies, they also reclaimed a sense of moral purpose in the war. This act of mercy became a symbol of the kind of peace they hoped to see in the aftermath of conflict, a peace that would not only rebuild cities, but also restore the dignity and humanity of the people who had been caught in the crossfire. For the German civilians, the moment marked a turning point in their understanding of the war. Many had endured years of hardship, their lives shaped by the Nazi regime's propaganda, which painted the Allies as brutal invaders. The war had stripped away their homes, their families, and their faith in the future. Now, standing before the very soldiers who had been bombing their cities, they experienced an unexpected act of kindness. The American soldiers, who had been the enemy just days earlier, were now offering something vital to their survival: food. This was an extraordinary act, one that contradicted everything the civilians had been taught to believe about the Allies. It was an act that called into question their preconceived notions of the enemy, and, in doing so, allowed them to see beyond the war and into the possibility of reconciliation. This moment of shared humanity between the American soldiers and the German civilians was more than just a chance to provide aid. It was a pivotal moment that represented the potential for healing. After years of brutality, it was a reminder that, despite the horrors of war, mercy could still be extended, and humanity could still be found. For the civilians, this act was a symbolic moment of recognition that their suffering was seen, and it offered a glimmer of hope for the future. Even in the ruins of their shattered city, the soldiers, too, were profoundly affected by the experience. Many of them had been hardened by years of combat, their emotions buried beneath the trauma of battle. But, as they shared their rations with civilians who had suffered just as much, if not more, they were confronted with the deeper moral complexities of their mission. The war was coming to an end, but the path to true peace would require more than just military victory. It would require an understanding of the shared humanity between all people, even those who had once been enemies. In that moment, the American soldiers were not just fighting for the defeat of Nazi Germany. They were also fighting for the possibility of rebuilding a war-torn world, one where mercy and compassion could heal the wounds of conflict. This encounter between the soldiers and the civilians was not just a single moment of mercy. It was a powerful message for the future. As the soldiers continued to move through Germany, they encountered not just resistance, but also the weary civilians who had been caught in the machinery of war. The act of sharing rations in Cologne became a microcosm of the larger, ongoing struggle for peace after the devastation of war. It showed that even after years of brutal conflict, humanity could still rise above the hatred and violence that had defined the war. The act of sharing food, in its simplicity, was one of the most profound moments of the war, an act that transcended the chaos and destruction of battle. It embodied the hope for a future where, in the ashes of war, nations could come together to rebuild, not just cities, but relationships, trust, and compassion. The American soldiers, through their generosity, had opened the door to a new kind of victory, one that would be defined not by domination, but by mercy. The aftermath of the war brought with it many challenges, but for those civilians who had lived through the horror of constant bombings and the collapse of Nazi Germany, the shared rations marked a moment that would remain in their memory long after the war ended. For the German civilians in Cologne, the days following the bombing raids and the arrival of the American soldiers were filled with uncertainty. But the act of kindness, when the American soldiers shared their rations, signified a turning point, not just in terms of physical survival, but in the emotional rebuilding of trust. The German population had been suffering greatly. By 1945, the war had taken a severe toll on their cities, with entire blocks reduced to rubble. Food scarcity was rampant, and many civilians were facing starvation. The German government, already on the verge of collapse, could not provide for the people it had led into a catastrophic war. While the Allies had been bombing military targets, the destruction of cities had left civilians vulnerable. Yet, when the American soldiers handed out their rations, it demonstrated a form of mercy that contrasted with the brutality of the war. In practical terms, this generosity had an immediate impact on the German civilians. Although the rations given by the U.S. soldiers were minimal in comparison to what was needed for long-term survival, they symbolized something more profound: the hope of rebuilding and the possibility of a new beginning. In a way, the soldiers were offering not only sustenance, but the notion that, even in a war-torn world, humanity could still extend beyond national lines. This gesture, though small in scale, played a pivotal role in shaping the post-war attitudes of the German civilian population towards the Allies. Psychologically, the American soldiers' act of mercy also helped to undercut the Nazi propaganda that had defined the German civilian view of the Allies. For years, the German populace had been indoctrinated with the idea that the Allies were merciless invaders. In contrast, the U.S. soldiers' willingness to share food with civilians showed them an entirely different side of the enemy. This moment of compassion made it clear to the German people that the war was not just about the defeat of the Nazi regime, but about moving forward in peace. It was an undeniable acknowledgement that not all enemies would be treated the same way, and the Allied forces, despite the destruction they had caused, were willing to help those they had fought against. For the U.S. soldiers, this act of kindness would leave an emotional mark as well. The soldiers, who had endured the same horrors of war, were not immune to the suffering of the civilians. They had been fighting for years, and many had witnessed the brutal destruction of the cities they were now liberating. For them, offering a meal to those who had been caught in the same war, victims of the very Nazi regime they had fought against, was an unexpected yet meaningful act of reconciliation. It was also an emotional release for many soldiers who had witnessed the devastation of war, allowing them to remember the human side of the conflict. From a military perspective, this act of generosity also had a longer-term effect on the dynamics of post-war Europe. The decision by American forces to help civilians, even in enemy territory, served as an important message during the early stages of occupation. As the Allies advanced through Germany, their treatment of civilians would be crucial in shaping how Germany rebuilt itself. The human compassion shown by the soldiers was a sharp contrast to the brutal tactics used by the Nazis, reinforcing the message that the war was not just about destruction, but about laying the foundation for peace. The U.S. soldiers' decision to share their rations also had wider political implications. The post-war reconstruction of Germany would be a long and difficult process, but the American approach, marked by mercy, aid, and cooperation, set the tone for the Marshall Plan and the broader efforts to rebuild Europe. The act of kindness shown by the soldiers to the German civilians signaled the start of a new chapter in the relationship between the two nations. While the physical rebuilding would take time, the foundations of mutual trust were being laid during those moments of generosity. As the war came to an end, the long process of rebuilding began, not just in terms of cities and infrastructure, but in terms of relationships between nations and individuals. The shared rations, though a small act in the grand scope of the war, became a lasting symbol of the moral and strategic decisions that would guide the post-war reconstruction of Germany and the broader European landscape. The U.S. soldiers who had shared their food with the German civilians may not have realized it at the time, but their actions helped to shape the narrative of reconciliation in post-war Europe. For the German civilian population, the aftermath of receiving food from their former enemies was both humbling and transformative. The devastation they had witnessed, the loss of homes, family members, and entire cities, had left them feeling hopeless. Yet, in the midst of this destruction, the kindness of the American soldiers provided a glimmer of hope. It was not just the food that mattered, it was the gesture itself. In a world that had been consumed by violence and hatred, this small act of mercy was a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could still prevail. The civilians who had endured years of bombing raids, loss, and grief now saw the possibility of recovery, both physically and emotionally. The sharing of rations symbolized the first steps toward healing a broken nation. In practical terms, the immediate effect of this generosity was clear. The civilians were given a small amount of food that helped them survive in the short term. However, the larger, more lasting impact was psychological. For the German people, this was a moment of redemption. It marked the beginning of a shift in how they viewed the Allied forces. The Americans, who had once been seen solely as enemies, were now seen as potential partners in rebuilding. The message sent by the American soldiers, that mercy and compassion could coexist with military victory, would resonate long after the war ended. This act also influenced how post-war Germany would come to understand its role in the world. The defeat of Nazi Germany had been a catastrophic event, leaving the country in ruins, both physically and morally. However, in the years that followed, the American commitment to rebuilding Europe, embodied by efforts like the Marshall Plan, became a cornerstone of the New World Order. The kindness of the American soldiers in Cologne and other cities, while small in scale, contributed to the broader efforts of American aid and rebuilding in the aftermath of the war. It represented the shift from vengeance to recovery, from destruction to renewal. For the U.S. military, the decision to share rations with the civilian population reflected a broader strategy of moral leadership. As the Allies worked to demilitarize Germany and dismantle the Nazi regime, they also had the difficult task of engaging with the civilian population in a way that would prevent future conflict. The actions of those American soldiers represented the potential for a peaceful transition from war to peace. While the German military might have been defeated, the civilian population had to be brought into the fold of peace, reconciliation, and rebuilding. The shared rations were a symbolic act of this process. The decision to extend kindness to the German civilians also influenced future military practices. The lesson learned during World War II, that treating the defeated with dignity could pave the way for a peaceful reconstruction, became a guiding principle for Allied forces in the years to come. In the rebuilding of Germany, efforts to provide aid and resources to the civilian population were not just about restoring infrastructure, but about restoring hope. For the German civilians, the American soldiers had shown them that, even after years of suffering, peace was possible, and recovery was achievable. As the years passed, the legacy of these acts of mercy would become a quiet, yet important part of the relationship between Germany and the United States. What began as an unexpected gesture in the midst of destruction grew into the foundation for future cooperation. The United States, through its post-war aid and its commitment to rebuilding Europe, would help Germany transition from a defeated and demoralized nation into a democratic and peaceful one. The act of sharing rations had symbolized more than just a temporary ceasefire. It had symbolized the possibility of healing a nation broken by war and offering a path to recovery for both individuals and nations alike. The act of sharing rations between American soldiers and German civilians in the aftermath of bombings in 1945 serves as one of the most powerful, yet often overlooked, symbols of humanity during wartime. In a conflict that had reduced cities to rubble and claimed millions of lives, this simple act of mercy, offering food to those who had been both victims and perpetrators of war, speaks volumes about the transformative power of compassion in the face of destruction. For the German civilians, the shock of receiving food from those they had once viewed as their enemies shattered not only their expectations, but also their deeply held beliefs about the nature of warfare. Having endured years of Nazi propaganda, the idea that the American soldiers, who had bombed their cities, could extend such an act of kindness was nearly impossible to believe. This moment forced them to confront the reality that the enemy they had been taught to despise could also be a source of mercy, offering not just sustenance, but hope. It was a poignant reminder that even after years of war, acts of humanity can bridge the deepest divides and heal the most profound wounds. For the American soldiers, this act was more than just a tactical maneuver. It was an embodiment of the very values they were fighting for. Amid the destruction and carnage of war, they showed that victory was not solely about military dominance or the defeat of the enemy. It was about the restoration of humanity. By sharing their rations, the soldiers demonstrated that, even in the most trying circumstances, kindness and compassion could triumph over hatred and violence. Their generosity was a gesture of peace, a quiet message that, after the war, the path forward was not one of revenge but of rebuilding and reconciliation. This moment of mercy transcended the immediate effects of food distribution. It became a symbol of the future that lay in the rebuilding of a war-torn Europe, in the healing of shattered societies, and in the forging of a new world order based on mutual understanding and cooperation. In the aftermath of the war, The Allied forces would help guide Germany through the difficult process of rebuilding. But it was the foundational acts of kindness like these that would set the tone for post-war relations. The shared rations were a microcosm of the broader strategy of American-led efforts to rebuild Europe through aid and the Marshall Plan. This act was an early gesture that signaled the dawning of a new era, a moment when the world, despite the scars of war, could rise from the ashes. For the Germans, it was a chance to see beyond the devastation, to recognize that, despite the devastation wrought by the war, there was still room for humanity and dignity. The U.S. soldiers, despite being enemies just days earlier, showed them that mercy could be extended, even in the darkest moments of conflict. For the Americans, this act reminded them that, in the end, the true measure of victory was not in the number of bombs dropped or enemies defeated, but in the ability to show mercy, to rebuild, and to offer a sense of hope to those who had lost everything. In the larger context of history, this moment encapsulated a shift in the narrative of war. While wars may be fought with weapons, victory is ultimately won in the hearts and minds of those involved. The aftermath of the war in Europe was not just about rebuilding cities and restoring governments, it was about healing the emotional and psychological wounds left by years of brutal conflict. The act of sharing rations was a small yet crucial step in that healing process. It was a reminder that, even in the wake of war's greatest devastations, there is still the possibility for humanity to rise above violence and create something new. A world defined not by destruction, but by compassion and a willingness to rebuild. The impact of this moment, though it may seem small compared to the broader sweep of history, is an enduring testament to the power of mercy. As nations rebuilt in the aftermath of World War II, it was these moments of humanity, small yet significant, that laid the foundation for the future of international relations, peace, and cooperation. The shared rations in Cologne were not merely about food. They were about a shared vision for the future, one where the human spirit, even in the most difficult times, could rise above the carnage of war to create a more compassionate world.